Welcome to what we call the Manifesto Media Academy, aka MMA, which is a name that Owen invented. Owen is very good at inventing names. He also invented this term, the Dark Renaissance, which most people don't know this fact.
No, I didn't. I don't think I've invented
I'm sure you invented it. Just anyway. He's a heavy metal guy, and so the three of us do this, and we're this is normally a closed group, but it's an open house tonight, and it's also a co-production of which with Parallax. Parallax is an online platform where we have magazine articles, where we've interviewed ZAK a number of times, and we have a lot of people like John Vervaeke, and it's you could say a postmodern media organization where we do something like teach all things to all people in all ways. This is a quote by John Amos Comenius. Did I get that right, Zach?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So ZAK Stein, Dr. ZAK Stein is an author. He's written a great book called Education in a Time Between Worlds, which I recommend to everybody. He's a prolific essayist and thinker, and you know, has a very prophetic sensibility, I think. I've had a few podcasts with him, and also with John Vervaeke, who's been on this channel before, and they're some of the most wonderful conversations I've had. So I'm very happy to have ZAK here tonight. And tonight he's going to talk to us about, I'm hoping you'll talk about, sort of give people your vision here, your greatest hits in a sense, but also talk about what you're up to at the moment with Comenius and your current thinking. So we have a little bit of your ideas, you know, your perennial ideas and what's on the cutting edge of your thought at the moment. Does that sound good, Zach?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So
sure.
Just going to say that the format here is we'll let Zach speak for about 45 minutes, and then maybe I'll ask a couple questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Are we all good?
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. It's exciting to speak. So I'll just talk for a bit. It was interesting. Owen sent out this morning on the intellectual dark web a video of Cadell last time speaking about his experience in higher education. So I looked at that this morning and I thought how interesting it would be to discuss one of the topics I've theorized a lot and that I discussed with you, Andrew, is teacherly authority. What is the nature of teacherly authority? And, you know, my broader, almost the broadest frame that I work with would be this notion of a time between worlds. And one of the things that characterizes that disworlding or unworlding is a fundamental disruption in the dynamics of teacherly authority. Sometimes that word doesn't work for people, but I'll unpack it in a way where you'll be like, okay, that makes sense. So if you get hung up on teacherly authority, give me a pass for a little bit. But the point is that we don't know what to make of asymmetries in capacity and also asymmetries in maturity, things of that nature. And so that's a deep issue. So I'm going to get to that. But some other key concepts that you have to get to understand why teacherly authority is even worth theorizing are the following. You know, one is that education and schooling are distinct. Schooling is a kind of interesting recent invention. And we can argue about when the first schools emerged and what constitutes a school. But certainly what we know of as modern schooling, which was actually basically invented for us by our friend John Amos Comenius, who I could speak about also at length. That's something very distinct, and that's served a very specific purpose. And so another thing that characterizes a time between worlds is that the institutions that handle education are fundamentally delegitimated. They become dysfunctional. And so then you get this kind of multifold educational crises of legitimation, capacity, intelligibility, and meaning. So the meaning crisis is hugely important. A subset of the crises that are created by the breakdown of teacherly authority and the breakdown of where education is institutionalized, in this case, modern schooling, which I argue is basically become as dysfunctional as any other of our major institutions, such as our food systems and material supply chains and economic systems and other those things. If you think those things are in self-terminating patterns that are eating the world, education also is fundamentally as kind of misincentivized and wrongly positioned in current context as many of our other systems are. So we have to be able to separate education as a broad sociological function, as broad as what I call social autopoiesis. We have to separate education from schooling very clearly right now, because we need an educational renaissance in a context where we have to let certain forms of schooling basically go by the wayside. And so part of doing that means distilling out this notion of teacherly authority, because teacherly authority occurs whether there are schools or not. Teacherly authority is also a basic social function. So that's kind of the first preamble. When you want to set up teacherly authority, and when you want to look at the dynamics of teacherly authority in the context of like the de-worlding or de-paradigming or time between worlds notion, you also have to think about the breakdown of schooling, separation of education from schooling, and looking at teacherly authority as some kind of like, precious social good. The absence of teacherly authority, as I define it, which I can get to, is one of the things that signals a kind of like terminal state of a culture and civilization. So that's a little bit of framing. And, our friend Comenius, who you mentioned, who lived in the 17th century, was theorizing directly on this point, because he was living also, I argue, in a time between worlds, a time between basic civilizational paradigms, let's put it that way. And so he was witnessing a breakdown in teacherly authority and a fundamental need to redesign educational infrastructures, broadly construed. So that's kind of the state of my thinking to date has been to move as an educational philosopher towards, very abstract theorizing in a sense about civilization itself, and the way what we think of as education, if you think of it very broadly construed, is so fundamental to society that it has existed in all, in anything that has been human. So I'm rambling a little bit now, but so that's worth noting. And the topic of teacherly authority, specifically, I began to address as a graduate student when I was in my 20s. This is what kind of Cadell reminded me of, speaking about his experience, because I was studying at Harvard and had incredible relationships with certain teachers. Prior to that, I had also had kind of unusual relationships with some teachers. And it's worth noting that there's bureaucratically mandated teacherly authority, which is that I learn from you because I fucking have to, because the state has empowered you to be my teacher. You may or may not have asymmetric capacity and knowledge, but the state says you do, so I learn from you. Bureaucratically mandated teacherly authority. Then there's something like, I don't know the best term to describe it, not organically emerging teacherly authority, right? And so I experienced, in the context of bureaucratic teacherly authority, by a miracle, there was actual also organic teacherly authority, which includes other things aside from asymmetric knowledge. It includes personality, interactions, and ethical commitments and other things. So I was in this mix of academia, but then I was also very seriously pursuing spiritual practice and religious apprenticeships, basically, in the context of Zen specifically, and then eventually Kabbalistic work, and then also fringe work, like new religion work. At the height of Andrew Cohen's community in Western Massachusetts, I was mingling with many of its members. It was pretty intense. That name may or may not ring a bell. I'm not going to get into that whole thing. So I'm also was also in this context of experience really diverse forms of really powerful teacherly authority. And all of a sudden, the concept kind of popped for me as an educational philosopher. And I realized, actually, I need to do some work on this. And as a developmental psychologist, actually had some of the work, because like some of the conceptual apparatus to actually think in some concrete terms about just what teacherly authority is. And so I actually published on it in the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice in like 2012, specifically looking at teacherly authority in the context of spiritual communities, what makes for a dysfunctional teacher-student relationship that is in the domain of spiritual practice, religious conception, those kinds of things. So it's a very interesting article. But what you start to see is that you can get fundamental cultural breakdowns in the actual ability to have legitimate teacherly authority. And this began to occur in some of the fringe areas in the new religion movement in the United States, and some of the ways that the United States adopted things like Buddhism and stuff like that. But you also get it in mainstream academia. So it's worth noting that the reason teacherly authority is so important to sort out is because if you can't carry out intergenerational relationships where you transmit essential knowledge and values and personality dispositions, then you can't go on with your social system. It's a basic function, and it actually mediates our relationship to reality. So this is like both a cognitive science point, if you're a Vygotskian, and a kind of psychoanalytical point, which is it's never just you and it. It's always you and the other and it. And so the nature of how this human comes into relationship with reality itself involves the question of teacherly authority and the possibility of the legitimate teacherly authority and the dynamics of how knowledge is actually transmitted between people. How the fuck does that actually work? Is that even the way to conceive it? Right. So I started to think about all of that stuff. And it becomes very interesting because it's clear that there are contexts, and I always use this example, like if I go to the auto mechanic, right? Like, I don't know a lot about internal combustion engines. A good mechanic actually knows a lot about internal combustion engines. So in that situation at the auto mechanic, I'm basically down at sensory motor systems or single representations in a Piagetian frame, and I can like point at the part of the car that's hot and smoking and be like, that thing is not doing well. The mechanic has a whole abstract way of thinking about the car, right? And so that is a clear example of like an epistemic, what I call an epistemic asymmetry. It's also an asymmetry of capacity, because you can do things with the car that I can't do. And it's worth noting it's an asymmetry of certain value commitments. Like the dude was clearly somehow committed to being a mechanic in a way that I was not. So there's this whole constellation of things that gathers around that relationship, where it could turn into a relationship where I actually want to learn more about my car and he teaches me about my car. And there's a dynamic of organic, legitimate teacherly authority. You can see how like that kind of relationship has to spring up in societies, or else they cease to exist in some form or another. So my argument is that we are getting into such a complex state of civilizational transition, which is a nice way of saying civilizational collapse, that we have to boil education all the way the fuck back down to that most primordial dynamic of teacherly authority. And if we are not able to do that, then we'll continually confuse education with its ever-changing instantiation as technology amplifies. So like when you get a GPT-3, right? GPT-3 is an AI. It's a text generating AI created by OpenAI. What that means is that you can train this thing on, let's say, all of Thomas Jefferson's works. And then you can ask it questions as if it's Thomas Jefferson, and it will reply to you in a way that really, really is like Thomas Jefferson. And now you can imagine hooking that thing up to a really convincing avatar in a virtual reality environment where you're like, whoa, you are having a conversation with Thomas Jefferson, right? But you're not. What is the actual dynamic of teacherly authority in that context? Now, different than reading a book written by Thomas Jefferson or letters written by Thomas Jefferson, where he, the man, is intending to communicate with you across some epistemic asymmetry, right? But here you have GPT-3, which is doing basically massive statistical analysis on the total aggregate of the semantic output and syntactical work of Thomas Jefferson, and then recombining it for you in novel ways in response to a novel question, right? Amazing. Like, thank you, technologists. Fun toy for the kids. But how do we actually make out the dynamics of teacherly authority in that context? And is the goal of those kinds of educational technologies to supplant teachers and supplant the embodied relationship and note the distributed relationship of teacherly authority to a centralized AI run kind of mainframe of simulated teacherly authority, right? And so this is, I wish it was a hypothetical scientific question or like a sci-fi novel, which it was, by the way. There were ones that kind of foreshadow this situation of the transfer of teacherly authority from the prior generation / actual human to the AI thing built by the prior generation, which is not a human. You see the difference? And that is a fundamental cultural shift, very, very fundamental, and coming very fast.
There we go.
So that's kind of like bringing the conversation of teacherly authority through the marketplace of spiritual ideas, where it has its own complex shit show. We can talk about, like, guru relationships as they're different from professor relationships, and all of that stuff. But then you realize that actually at the cutting edge of technology right now, we're fundamentally altering kind of, I don't know the right word to use, kind of like source code human stuff, specifically the dynamic of teacherly authority. So yeah, that as an educational philosopher is interesting. I was actually speaking with representatives from the Swedish Royal Academy yesterday about this problem, weirdly enough. And the conversation went in the direction of, well, we need to find ways to get AI to empower, maybe not the right word, to increase the skill and capacity of teachers and to actually deepen the profession of teaching into something like scientific, philosophical field or expertise. Otherwise, we'll just obsolete the teachers and get teachers out of education entirely. And so that doesn't mean we can't do the Thomas Jefferson thing. It just means that for every Thomas Jefferson thing, there's at least a teacher or something like that. Or even better, allowing teachers to cooperate with the computer scientists who are doing this innovation in a rich enough contextualized way that the innovations would be attentive to the actual needs of existing circumstance, which is usually not the case when technologists get involved in education. There's stories to tell about that, but basically if you've made a lot of money, then you're allowed to do whatever the hell you want with millions of people's kids. Like the public education system in the United States in particular has been the hobby horse of philanthropists since it was first scaled up to handle all the immigrants. And they were interested in turning all the immigrants into workers, incidentally enough. So the question of what it would look like to hand over the metaverse, AI-run, teacherless educational platforms to the people who are wealthy enough to build them right now is a very important question. And of course, the work I do for the Consilience Project, and this will kind of bring us up to date, the work I do for the Consilience Project is about propaganda and the difference between propaganda and education. So any technology that can be used to educate can be used even more aggressively to propagandize, and usually ends up kind of falling into those hands. So you can imagine the Thomas Jefferson thing, the Thomas Jefferson GPT-3 Web3 avatar, with a slight change in that algorithm so that Thomas Jefferson says things maybe he wouldn't really have said. And yet you're taught to believe this is an objective algorithm that tells you things that Thomas Jefferson would have said. And so you slightly use this thing disguised as education to kind of dictate propaganda. And then, of course, you throw in deep fakes, and you could have a micro-targeted advertisement where your dead father, a perfect representation of your dead father, confronts you with background music and convinces you to take a certain political stance. And again, I wish that was science fiction, but experts in the field like Samuel Woolley, experts in the field of computational propaganda, Samuel Woolley, I think is UT Austin, actually worried about that precise scenario. The kind of like totalized metaverse propaganda delivery apparatus. The phone, just this 2D thing you hold in your hand, already is pretty good at like brainwashing you. I almost said brain damaging you, but that's true too. So you can imagine you wrap that whole thing around your face, and you get some haptic sensors and a whole bunch of other stuff, and you go to town with a form of propaganda that sets off a kind of escape velocity towards a form of social control that none of us are actually interested in. At the back of Bostrom's edited book of catastrophic risks, there's one on just global authoritarianism. And so the kind of shadow side of the philosophy of education is, in fact, those dynamics of totalized propaganda. And that's the way I characterize it in one of the Consilience papers. There's the evil twin of education is propaganda. They're very, very similar. And the same technologies used to deliver one are used to deliver the other. Again, a lesson from Comenius, right? Who was confronting like crazy innovation in propaganda in the wake of the printing press, which fueled the 30 Years' War. Many of the conceptions we have of hell come from the competing weaponization of hell as a mimetic complex in the propaganda wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, where it was like, oh shit, going to hell is, I should just convert, because that propaganda was scared the shit out of me. And so in that context, they were printing these posters and doing things at scale with printing presses that were remarkable, flooding whole urban areas with 30 Years' War propaganda. But Comenius himself, of course, got a hold of printing presses with the help of Protestant aristocrats, and probably the Church of England and Queen Elizabeth, who funded the operation. So maybe Comenius was like actually working for British intelligence, is an interesting subplot. In any case, he used those printing presses to create anti-propaganda, to create education books that would teach people new words and teach people how to speak Latin who couldn't speak Latin, and teach people to read by identifying word and image through like a crazy innovation in the use of printing technologies. He did this. And so the whole story, I lay that out in this perspective essay, which Andrew mentioned. So that's kind of the state of play, kind of a race between heaven and hell, as it were, where we're about to enter unprecedented territory in educational technology, and more specifically, technologies fundamentally disruptive enough to fuck with teacherly authority in a way that's like, it's already fucked with at the cultural level. Teacherly authority is already complex at the cultural level, because of the way we've problematized authority in general, and the way we've problematized skill and capacity and merit and relationship to truth and value and a whole bunch of other things that make the dynamic work. But it hasn't been so fundamentally undermined that we transfer the responsibility of teacherly authority for a whole generation, let's say, or a large segment of a generation over to a technology entirely, which is the scenario that I'm saying is like completely feasible, being worked on. Venture capital is into it. Because teachers are hugely problematic, like from a efficiency, like abstract, hyper-modernist perspective. Teachers' unions are a big problem. The considered judgments and discretions of teachers get in the way of maximal efficiency, and they have their own opinions, and they can be co-opted by so you can see all of these incentives to get teachers disempowered, and then the technology steps in. So I'm arguing actually that teachers as we know them are done. Those schools are done. So don't mistake my argument. This AI thing is coming. We need to somehow build distributed educational hub networks where we can basically create institutions that can reconfigure teacherly authority in the digital world with GPT-3, right? With VR realities, and with just the kind of Web 2 type social media and Wikipedia kind of information mess that will basically be hard to get back in the bottle. So there's a whole mix of new problems, not to mention structural unemployment that's accelerating, and other factors that have me thinking like Comenius about retooling the entire complex of education, politics, economics, which is a triple that he specifically mentions. That all three of those move together and have to move together. Religion's in there somewhere. Comenius was, of course, almost always talking about religion. And so, yeah. So that'll be, I think I'll pause there actually at the half-hour mark instead of going to 45 minutes, because I feel like I'm rambling and leading you guys maybe in places where I should be directed. So someone asked me a question.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Zach, if you don't mind. And then I'd ask everybody to write their questions in the chat. And then Eskel can kind of pick people and they can come and ask their question in person. And so we can have a list of questions. So Zach, my first question is, I like very much the idea of education being anti-propaganda. I think that's a great way of framing it or thinking about it. I know, I also teach in a university, and then I do this. So I guess my question is, what's the difference? When I teach in a university, I have a feeling that a few of my students are alive, and the rest of them are there to get their degree, and some of them are on fire. But whereas when I'm doing this kind of thing, most of the people who are here because they want to be and because they want to learn something, and there's something really compelling going on. So I see these two worlds of education kind of, I see them on both sides. So that's my question is, what's the difference and between what we're doing here, in all these conversations we're having with people like John Vervaeke and sort of this spontaneously emerging community with teachers who have some kind of spontaneous authority, as you're saying, and there's a sort of hierarchy and a kind of thing, but it's completely undefined, and nobody's making any money doing it, and people are just doing it out of love. We're all amateurs. The word amateur means to love, I think. Anyway, sorry, it was a bit rambly, but
that makes sense. I mean, there's several dynamics in there. I mean, the state of university education is pretty bad, and it's a decaying institution in a civilization that is in decline, for the most part. So I'm not saying there aren't places in the academy where things are still going well, but I am saying that for the most part, you're looking at least in the United States, both a fiscal crisis and a cultural crisis at the heart of higher education. And that leads to, again, a general delegitimation in the eyes of the youth as to what the hell is actually going on here. And so if you have only ever experienced the relationship between teacher and student in the context of an institution, that's really hard to kind of legitimate its practices. Then you come to have a kind of embodied misunderstanding of what teacherly authority is, because you've only ever seen illegitimate bureaucratic forms of teacherly authority. Now, that's usually not true, because there's usually someone in your life somewhere who you've encountered and you've had that experience, because it's even hard to get off the ground without that in the parental-child relationship. But so to your response of like, what's the difference? Well, non-institutionalized forms of organically occurring conversation lead to, if the emotional tone is correct, the spontaneous emergence of dynamics of teacherly authority as you're occurring, which is hard to put your finger on, but very exciting. As Aristotle said, people love to learn. Like, it's actually one of the deepest things we love to do, is to learn and to deepen connection to others and to reality itself through relationship, which is usually through a teacher-student relationship. And again, this is such a flexible term, because as the case with the mechanic shows, any situation in which there are those kinds of asymmetries, even for a moment in a conversation with someone else who otherwise is usually on the up end of the epistemic asymmetry, but who doesn't understand this specific thing, and then you flip the hierarchy. So we're talking about very flexible dynamic hierarchies of teacherly authority. There's no place for that in schools. And in some, unfortunately, in some kind of guru religion context, there's no place for that either. And this is one of the dynamics I recognized as problematic, not in the sense of like, get away from it, but in the sense of like, this is always going to be a problem about dynamics of teacherly authority in religious contexts, is that they're not just teaching you about how to make good pasta. They're not just teaching you how to do equations or how to fix a car or how to write, some bullshit essay in the humanities. They're teaching about things that supposedly apply to all dimensions of your life. So there's a breadth of domain expertise that's claimed by the quote guru or spiritual teacher, which has become deeply problematic in our cultural context. This is another conversation, but it's just saying that, yeah, institutionalized teacherly authority becomes problematic as the institutions decay. But there's always this potentiality in every relationship for there to be transmissions and educational potential. So that means that as the institutions decay, in the wilderness, you get mystery schools where you remember again what it's like to engage in these types of intergenerational transmission and cross paradigmatic kind of teacher-student relationship. So I think I moved away from your question. There was a second part to your question after the part about the kids who were bored in your class.
Well, it was about sort of like the nature of what is happening here versus, let's say, well, I mean, you went into the guru area, and that's the kind of authoritarianism. And then the problem with spontaneously emerging hierarchies, and that they develop cults instead of mystery schools. And so how do we formalize the authority, in this very informal environment, without getting into, well, we talked about Girard a lot, and getting into a rivalrous relationships with people, and there's not, if there's a hierarchy, but it's not official, and nobody has a title or a name, or nobody's supposed to be better than anybody else, then we could have it with, that could be a very dangerous situation as well, right? So how do we formalize this? How do we do that? How do we?
I wouldn't formalize it. I mean, not now. The formalization, again, of bureaucratic teacherly authority is one of the things that leads to institutions that inevitably decay and actually calcifies a certain kind of like conformity. But on the edges, like I said, in the wilderness where you end up building the mystery schools, you can also build cults. And this gets to that second part of your question that I was trying to get to, which is education and propaganda, which is the difference between teaching and brainwashing, which is the difference between reason and coercion, right? And now those of you with a postmodern bent who like Foucault and Lacan and folks like that will say that, well, the reason and coercion are not mutually exclusive categories, and reason and coercion and propaganda and education and love and violence, sex and violence bleed into one another, to which the answer is yes, of course. But for some purposes, we can usefully distinguish these things because they're like kind of attractors in the space of possibility. And it's certainly the case that there's a difference between sincere teacherly dynamics in which education is taking place and insincere manipulative dynamics in which brainwashing / propaganda is taking place. And so these are two extremes, but things bleed into one another, of course. And sometimes there's baits and switches. It starts out as actual education and then it turns into brainwashing, or we use a little bit of coercion to get you in and then flip it and make it actually depth and true education. So there's a mixture there, but some of the key signs are clear. And I write about this at length with regards to kind of propaganda in the public sphere, but the same lessons apply at the level of kind of dynamics of teacherly authority in the level of a classroom or the level of a small community. Much of the work that I pull on comes from Robert Lifton's work, which was about brainwashing techniques in Maoist China, essentially. Very powerful work, but what it shows there are kind of the basic neurological / sociological pressure points that can be leveraged to do the opposite of education, right? Which is to, but yet the dark twin of education.
To turn us into monsters.
Right, which is basically to so transform someone's relationship to information and authority that they come to believe things and do things which they really wouldn't have otherwise done. So this is called undue influence to legal category. So like Patty Hearst, right? Mm-hmm. Patty Hearst is kidnapped by leftist radicals, locked in a closet, et cetera, et cetera. Those are important et ceteras, but she ends up robbing banks with them successfully and then is arrested and she's put in prison. Before that, she was just some rich girl who never had leftist proclivities or would have robbed a bank, but she's put in prison and held accountable, even though arguably she was under undue influence. She was later pardoned by Clinton, but that took a while. This was in the 60s that she was, but the argument was, and there's precedents in other areas like sex trafficking and other places where if you looked on the camera, you'd see, oh, it looks like they're into it. It looks like they're doing this of their own volition. Looks like they're making choices here. But if you look at the dynamics in place sociologically and psychologically, they're actually under undue influence. They've been coerced into valuing and thinking certain things, and often into valuing and thinking things that actually don't make sense to value and think if you really were to think it through. So we can get into the signs of that. But those lessons about how you can basically through coercion change people's mindsets, of course, was one of the main things behind advertising and public relations, both of which were industries that were supercharged by propaganda during the World Wars, and then again during the Cold Wars. So we're in a society that has become scientifically refined in the administration of manipulative and coercive information. The public schools, of course, became part of that. And the signs of it are several, One is just duress and absence of kind of generosity, basically. Like if you're thinking about if you're a teacher and you're trying to earnestly get somebody to come to think in a better way and to come to act in a way that's more suited to who they are and to how the world works, right? The kind of earnest intention to engage in that would lead you to create a certain circumstance, right? If you wanted to get them to do something that they really didn't want to do, and kind of wasn't in their best interest, and maybe didn't make actual sense, then you would create a condition where you could actually catch them at their worst and most manipulable, inundate them with information, deprive them of nutrition and sleep, create contexts of like.
That's what drug dealers do, isn't it? That's how you get people addicted.
This is how I think it's so Steve Hassan, who's the kind of leading expert on cults in the United States, works with these lawyers who work with this concept of undue influence in legal proceedings. Because again, if you are running drugs for a drug dealer, he's not with you. You're still walking down the street delivering the drugs. Right now, in your mind, there's nothing else that you can possibly do. So you get arrested and you're prosecuted as if you are acting just as a straight criminal. But if you can show that basically this guy was threatening my family and he indoctrinated me into thinking these things about myself and et cetera, and there's a list of conditions where, Jesus, we can't really hold this guy as accountable as we'd like to, because he was under undue influence. And so the argument I make in these propaganda papers in the Consilience Project is basically that the same kind of thing now is being created on social media. That before social media, you had propaganda that was kind of like below the threshold of atomic, right? Like it has now become a weapon that is basically the equivalent. It's like, this is a weapon that creates conditions that make it uninhabitable for everyone. Not just the ones you pointed them at. This is a weapon that creates a dynamic of mutually assured destruction. And
is that because they've gotten into your unconscious mind, in a sense, or
because it's
fully,
like, so I mean, think about it. Like, if you were being propagandized in the lead up to World War I, that was probably the most effective propaganda campaign in history, the mobilization of the United States in preparation for World War I. Now, you could maybe argue that the Nazis had a more effective propaganda campaign. We could argue that, but I don't know. This was impressive. The Committee on Public Information, I can tell that whole story. You were inundated with propaganda, but not nearly to the degree that one can be inundated now with propaganda in terms of the total presence of manipulative information in your sensory field per 24-hour period. And the other thing to note is that propaganda campaign worked because the Committee on Public Information sealed up the information environment so tight that there was no counter narrative to speak of in the lead up to World War I in the United States about what the war meant. And the barrier of access to participation in the information war campaign was so high. It was so expensive, both to get the basic technology of communication going. Like, not everyone can have a radio station. Not everyone can print 1 million newspapers. Digital changed all of that. Digital lowered the barriers of access to information warfare profoundly, and changed the kind of like total presence of manipulative information in your sensory field per 24-hour period ratio thing. And so what that means is that we are not just given powerful propaganda, we're getting powerful propaganda at a higher speed of intensity. And this is the important point. Not from one centralized place. We're getting it from advertisement campaigns and political campaigns and activist campaigns and public health campaigns, all of which have access to the brainwashing machine of social media, if I can just speak frankly. Now, what China did was like, fuck that. Let's have it from a centralized voice. Then there'll be social coordination. Right. But of course, there's gross force and censorship and a whole bunch of other problems with this, and we can get into that. But the point is that the internet in the United States is in an area now where the propaganda campaigns are more powerful than they've ever been, but they're working less well because you're not getting limbically hijacked like you used to get. You're getting limbically overwhelmed. So the limbic hijacking of World War I was, okay, I'm tapping into your emotional centers. to pull you up and into now concerted, dedicated, rational effort towards a goal, right? And it's going to take a long commitment, years of your work. You're going to have to be focused on it. Like, it's not what's occurring now with propaganda. We are limbically hijacked briefly into the consumption of more information and then limbically overloaded towards reactionary action. And so this is becoming clearer and clearer that the centralized propaganda campaigns are meeting predictable, and this is the point, predictable counter-expert discourse and counter-propaganda campaigns, not seeing that this is a mutually assured destruction dynamic, continuing to put money and effort into the thing, and driving us into basically deeper and deeper Baudrillardian simulations and institutional decay and identity fragmentation and so on and so on. So that's why it's the mutually assured destruction dynamic is one of like an increasing toxification emanating or radiation emanating from the mimetic weaponry to the point where every space of communication becomes uninhabitable. So that's the worst case scenario. Of course, we're here talking, so that's great. But I don't know how many of you have mimetic complexes that you've basically had brainwashed into you by Facebook that makes it impossible for you to actually hear what I'm saying. Which is not a joke. Like when you look at it clearly, like there were soldiers who were captured in Korea, United States soldiers captured in Korea, brought to CCP re-education camps, who chose not to come home, to stay in North Korea because of the effectiveness of the brainwashing. And one of the key techniques is the thought terminating cliche, which is, I love the thought, that just that phrase gets it, right? So the thought terminating, basically being forced to rehearse in discourse, thought terminating cliches under social pressure and duress long enough confuses the identity field, which is a semantic and energetic and kind of like authority dynamic social field. So that eventually you're sitting in a circle long enough in one of these CCC camps, you haven't, CCP. CCC was all right. It's a different story. CCP was a problem. And then you get basically forced into saying things about fundamental topics, about the difference between capitalism and communism, about what are respectable human virtues, about, you know, whether the United States is imperialist or not, you know, about whether you're a racist or not in the CCP camps in Korea. And you start to say shit. You start to say what they want you to say, need you to say in order to get sleep, in order to get food. So you rehearse the thought terminating cliches. The thought terminating cliches would be like, oh, that's a thought critical of the CCP, regardless of what it is. It is bourgeois ideology. It is imperialist thought, right? So you stop conversation, you stop thought with a cliche, which has social sanction, and you're pressured by the social system to use the semantic content, which disrupts your semantic and identity field to the point where you really kind of forget who you are and what you actually think and are committed to.
I wonder, Zach, I'm going to open it up to questions now, but I wonder if we're doing that with COVID and vaccines. I'm sorry, or other issues. I'm sorry to bring that in, but we are repeating a lot of cliches all the time. Like we're doing that. We're not under duress. We don't have machine guns at our head telling us what to think about these sort of things, but we're just repeating these mantras which have been fed to us through the media. About I just using that as a sort of.
But it's important to get that, like,
yeah,
cliches have been fed to us through the media, thought terminating cliches. The one of the principles of like modern advertising was a thought terminating cliche. Like a jingle is a thought terminating cliche, basically. Mm-hmm. So we were fed thought terminating cliches for a long time through broadcast, but we were never put, unless you were in a re-education camp, you were never put in a context to have to use them under social pressure in defense of access to basic social goods, right? Which is what the social media allows for, basically. If you are in a situation where you feel you need to be validated in your identity on social media, which is many people's situation, and you feel you need to stay engaged with social media to stay relevant, informed, even employed, then you're in a situation where you will be forced to rehearse the thought terminating cliches dictated by the propagandist before other people. Become committed to things you might not otherwise be committed to that are essential to the formation of your identity. That didn't occur readily in the context of broadcast propaganda. It could happen. Housewives get together and rehearse the thought terminating cliches of the advertising. Businessmen get together and rehearse the thought terminating cliches, but it wasn't fucking 24/7, and it wasn't to the extent that we have now with social media. So yeah, and that's the point of the propaganda papers, is like, we have to fundamentally rethink how much we value sanity and peace, because we can't keep running the information war and culture war this way, because everyone loses.
Great. So which means creating anti-propaganda, which is what
Right,
you're
which
doing
means-
right now.
Which means
Yeah.
retooling, which means retooling the exact infrastructure towards educational ends, which is another conversation.
Okay, wonderful. So Eskil, I've been so involved in this conversation that it's hard for me I can't follow the chat at the same time. Can you
Andrew,
pick
I
out a
got it.
conversation? Go ahead.
Owen's
Go
got it.
ahead, Owen.
I got it. So, Oliver, you had the first question, and it was something to do with media and propaganda. Do you feel that Zach has answered that, or do you want to throw it in, just try and open up a bit more thinking? Oliver, are you there?
You there, Oliver? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No, just because the definition you provide for propaganda in the Consilience Project articles is fairly narrow. So sorry, I associate, and a lot of kind of media projects, a lot of communication projects would fall into the bucket of propaganda. So I'm just curious if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, maybe formalize exactly what you mean by propaganda, and if it's always bad, if you always want to avoid it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, it is not always bad. There are very limited contexts, I believe, where you can completely justify the use of certain types of propaganda. I mean, if you are comfortable with the analogy of, like, propaganda on a large scale as a dynamic of kind of distorted teacherly authority, then you could look at teacherly authority in a smaller context and imagine, like, is there ever a case where you're working with someone where you really don't have time to reason with them, and you just need to not have the kid touch the hot stove, right? Like, I don't have time to do the education thing with you now about the hot stove, kid. I just need you to not touch the hot stove, so I'll yell at you. Which is like the miniature version of a parental propaganda campaign, where you're using speech, right? And you're kind of using argument, but you're mostly using the threat of force, and like the use of force through voice. So there are contexts like that. And you could argue perhaps that the lead up to World War I was in fact one of those contexts in the United States. It's very, very complex. So I'm not saying like propaganda is always bad. I'm saying be aware there's a lot of propaganda out there, guys. And don't think, especially things coming to you from the media complex and the academia complex, and what occurs on social media, don't start to get into things where you think you're getting in touch with reality when you're spending times interacting in those contexts. So there's also a radical argument about the total saturation of the information space with propagandistic speech, which means, yeah, a lot of projects I would class as propaganda. And they think they're doing great work, and maybe they are, maybe they're doing the useful propaganda that needs to be done. But I'm also saying, like, let's not confuse education with propaganda just because we're making propaganda that we agree with, which is usually what you get. You get people saying basically, like, listen, this isn't propaganda because these things are correct. Even though I'm using all the manipulative tools of propaganda, this shit is this is the true stuff. Propaganda is only fake news. And I'm saying, no, that's actually not. It's actually not true. It's a structural relationship between in the interaction. It's the dynamic of teacherly authority that characterizes it. So it's not always bad, but it is ubiquitous. So the other arguments in the propaganda paper are basically that, it's become normalized, that bad faith manipulative communication has become normalized. And it's not the case that like, oh, it used to be great and no one manipulated anyone else with speech and there was no, we've always done this. We've always had bad faith communication and we've always had propaganda. The argument is that we've reached certain thresholds of social complexity and technological complexity where the consequences of those things and the saturation of those things into domains of life where they didn't used to exist needs to start being paid attention to. And so social media is one of those thresholds for total information war. Like we either need to, like Taiwan has done, protect our information ecosystem and the minds of our citizens with a new form of civic infrastructure and architecture and a new form of digital open society and democracy, or this goes towards some form of chaos or some form of oppression. And we're obviously vectoring towards a kind of techno-feudalist chaos at this point, at least in the United States. So yeah, if you're seeing propaganda everywhere, that's because it is everywhere. And if you think some propaganda is good, it may be because you just disagree with it, or it may be because it is in that small sector of stuff, which again is also contextual. Where does it happen? When does it happen? But there is a legitimate space for it. Nice.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Clinton, over to you, my friend.
Hey, Zach, great talk. The story as I've been following it is like in the 30s, the University of Chicago standardized pedagogy into like this one-size-fits-all teachers college, where how to teach was separated totally from the specific subject being taught. And then in the 80s, you've got teaching being redefined as like teachers are the co-learners with their students, and the teachers and the students are together on the journey of learning, right? So like these two like really like historically contingent inflection points, I'm sure among others within like the systems of pedagogy within education, like are they important providing context to like what's changed in universities to where teachers now have more of a young teachers you see complaining on the internet? And I know you got lots of young academics and people who chose to get careers in academia who complain about having an imposter syndrome in front of their students. It's like, oh no, that's normal, don't worry, you'll get over it. But they rely entirely on prepared coursework and prescribed readings in lieu of just standing in front of the class and demonstrating total mastery of their subject as like a rhetorical order, right? So if you look at the YouTube stars who are becoming people's gurus or becoming people's teachers or becoming big, they're doing so as part of a constellation of people who can just out of their own brain talk about something extremely smart, and that's what teaching was 100 years ago, and we've gotten away from that by these two inflection points. Like, is that story critical to restoring within education an ideal of what a teacher should be in a classroom?
Sorry. It's an interesting way into the problem, right? So you're talking about something which has to do with the kind of ideology and scientization of the role of teaching in schools. So that's important. It's not education, it's schools. These are schools. And these are teachers who, in many contexts, end up working for the state. So it's a modern public school, the University of Chicago. And in that age of, this was a lot, again, that philanthropic influx. Like if you look at the founding of the education graduate schools, they are, they're the result of that kind of penetration of capital into the formation of future humans. So it's important to see that kind of like discourse setting the tone for how we think about what a teacher should be and what a teacher is. And because people confuse education with schooling, we end up being in a situation where your disdain and confusion about the demonstrable illegitimacy of the teacherly authority you've encountered in bureaucratized contexts leads you to discount the possibility of teacherly authority altogether. And so that's a part of the educational crisis, is that schools end up sucking so much that it breaks your ability to learn ongoingly in other contexts. Now you do things that are, of course, everyone's always learning all the time, but but the idea of like a directed, learning in the interest of broad advancement of your projects as a person and identity structure and things of that nature. So I'm with you. And then this other bit is what's interesting is that, and as I was a musician, so I had music teachers too, right? And there are some contexts which are a lot harder to fake teacherly authority. Like, you can get an institutional mandate from the state and stand up in front of kids and have read the history chapter before and then tell them about the history chapter they're about to read and kind of fake teacherly authority in some domains because of the institutional bureaucratic support and kind of like smoke and mirrors that you're a teacher, right? But then there are other contexts where it's just like, it's such an obvious demonstration of more advanced and desirable capacity that you were drawn into it. Now, what's interesting is that not everyone who can show advanced capacity is actually a good teacher. Teaching is something more specific than just being smarter than somebody else. And this is another point. Teacherly authority, it's a dynamic, it's a two-way dynamic where both parties assume responsibility. And both parties have a commitment to the kinds of negotiations that need to occur in that relationship to advance the least empowered party more. It's not that the teacher doesn't benefit, but this is an asymmetric dynamic that's usually a cross-generational asymmetric dynamic. And this is something that our society completely misunderstands because we're so narcissistic. But basically, there is an investment in the youth which does not return to the elder. And so that's key to get in a true dynamic of intergenerational transmission, which is why the human capital theory model of large-scale education is so problematic, because the idea is that, well, we invest in the kids and the kids return that investment in the economy. But this isn't a relationship of symmetry. And that's what's important to get. Fundamental, if you boil it down, again, back to mom, it's a fundamental relationship of asymmetric dependency. This is where we come from. It's who we are. The teacher-student relationship, as I'm speaking about it, that kind of dynamic of teacherly authority, which could be reworded, and I'd be happy, covers that basic asymmetry of dependency. And it's an attitude that we need to have, or else we completely mishandle intergenerational transmission. And then the world as we know it comes to an end and something else occurs, because we're not passing on knowledge, we're not passing on relationship to truth, we're not passing on dispositions and emotion. And that's the other thing to note: the bureaucratized forms of teacherly authority limit that authority to a very narrow thing. Math. You don't learn how to be a good person from your math teacher. You learn math from your math teacher. And so that's good in one way, but you can see how it's problematic in another way. And so when you're speaking about the kind of ancient contexts where you had oral cultures, it usually was not just the ability to speak and be intelligent. It was a whole constellation of factors of the whole person, basically, the whole personality. And so what's interesting about the breakdown of institutional forms of teacherly authority, and this is what kind of we've been circling around, is you get this emergence of non-institutionalized forms of teacherly authority, and and this is the McLuhan-esque point, a kind of strange rehearsal of prior forms of teacherly authority under new conditions of communication technology. And so that's what's emerging in a lot of these spaces, I would argue. But there are still limitations to broadcast. And as I said, right now, most of the potential is being misused. So wherever there's a frontier of teacherly authority, there's a frontier of propaganda. So the very same structures that allow us to do this kind of thing also allow people to ostensibly display superior capacity who actually do not have superior capacity, but they've got great PR and great production and great writers. Right. So I'm saying, like, it's tricky. It's tricky as we go Wild West. And most in the schools, what's interesting about the schools, because I seem to be anti-school, but I love this. I mean, schools are so important. Teachers are amazing. So I end up bashing them, but I don't want to do that. But the reason the schools survive and the reason society hasn't collapsed because the schools are such a nightmare is because of the creation of teacherly authority in those contexts anyway, despite the decaying bureaucratic authority structure, that there are teachers who are still teachers, even in schools that are really, really bad. And they can convince the kids through an actual demonstration of competence. And again, in some domains, it's easier, like music. It was very clear, like, oh, I would really like to be able to play bass like that. That was really cool. Show me how to do that. Different from someone pontificating about history. It's like, I don't care about history. I want to get checks and learn how to play bass. Oh, that is cool. Teach me how to play a bass, right? So there's always these possibilities of the spontaneous emergence of those possibilities. There's always that, even in these decaying educational contexts. So if for all the teachers out there or people who are working in these schools, like maybe leave, maybe totally leave. Like if it's killing you, leave. But if not, there's still completely work to be done in those contexts. You just have to understand that you have to generate that trust and you have to generate that willingness to commit to an actual relationship of mutual responsibility. You have to create that outside of the bureaucratic container that's been basically delegitimated by the students' perceptions. So it's an answer to that question.
Awesome. Anis?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I think you responded to a lot of it already, but I was wondering about looking at it from the point of view of someone who's creating content or trying to transmit something. How would you look at the teacher authority? What are the qualities that can correlate to teacher authority and good practices? And maybe as a second question, how you project that in what you talked about, distributed education hubs. That's maybe like projecting that in a network level.
So I actually didn't complete my full thought, and I will complete it thanks to your question, because you reminded me of what is the difference between education and propaganda, right? So I mentioned that if you're propagandizing someone, you want to do something like they did in those CCP camps, and you want to overwhelm them with information and destabilize their perception and kind of hit them in the limbic system and make them feel more than think. And then when you lead them to think, bring them into thought terminating cliches and all of that kind of stuff, right? So you want to do that. The other thing you do if you're making propaganda is set up an asymmetric epistemic relationship, which is key to teacherly authority, right? So we're good there. But then you make that an unbridgeable thing. So the propagandist has no desire to bring the student, or in this case, the propagandized citizen, they have no desire to bring them up to their level of knowledge and capacity, right? They've created a basically unbridgeable asymmetric epistemic relationship, right? So it's unbridgeable. Whereas the teacher says, okay, right now it's an asymmetric relationship of knowledge and capacity and other things. But my whole goal, and your whole goal, as we both know, and that's the agreement, is to bring you up to my level and beyond. Key point, right? And so what that means is that the student and the teacher look at the same text together, right? The student and the propagandist and the propagandized is different. He looks at something and then comes and tells you about it. And you're like, hey, can I see that thing? And he's like, nope, just I can understand it, really. Or, you haven't done enough prostrations, or given enough money to the group or whatever, right? And so that is a very different relationship and worth noting. So there's the structure and intensity and container of the information transmission, which can be coercive or not, right? And in this context, for someone like you're saying, producing content, how much do you use the cultural tropes that have been manufactured and perfected by the propagandists in your work. It's important, right? Like, how much do you do quick cut, confusing, multiple information stream presentations, right? I think of Jason Silva, right? What the hell is Jason Silva doing, right? It's a strange form of aesthetic, basically philosophical propaganda. It is bleeding entertainment together too closely with education. And you see the motive, right? Everyone's so inundated with sensory overwhelm and entertainment and propaganda that if you put out something that is not like that, they're just not going to pay attention to it. So you want to make it sticky and catchy, and 1,600 points are made, and there's techno music, and it's coming at you, and your limbic system's involved for some reason, even though it's just to fill that. And so it's like, whoa, like you just became the problem you were trying to overcome in inviting people to become reflective. You're inviting the people to become reflective, and yet you're inundating them with these types of hypercut, super high produced kind of limbic system invoking music, etc. Right? So that's the first lesson. It's like, what's that container and what's the nature of that transmission? And are you basically creating a product that's going to be indistinguishable from the kind of cultural noise that is the manipulative informational environment, or not? And then the other one is, are you making it so that the person can engage with your work in such a way that they could somehow come to know as much as you? Or are you basically claiming to have worked so hard and have some kind of strange and inaccessible access to this form of knowledge? Or you're just some kind of genius that makes it so that, like, you know, you can learn from me, but I would never help you or even think that you could do things such as I do. Right, which is the stance of the guru, basically. And so most gurus will combine that stance. This is an unbridgeable epistemic asymmetry, boys. Sorry. They'll combine that stance with the information overload and sleep deprivation and change your diet and make you do shit you don't want to do. And then you're in a situation of basically being trapped kind of by your own free will, but not by your own free will. And yet from the outside, it looks like you're choosing to do it, but really you've been coerced through the manipulation of information and your self-esteem system and a whole bunch of other things. So that's a little bit to the point there. And then the Education Hub Network is a large vision. I speak about it at length in my second book. And it basically involves kind of repurposing certain existing educational infrastructures like large high schools and repurposing them as hubs in a distributed community-wide education network in which all community members participate, as opposed to a cloistered space, which is the only place where education happens. So it's some combination between like a library, childcare center, co-working space, and museum and makerspace. That's what the high school becomes. And then out of the high school radiates in a hub-like fashion, pop-up classrooms, homeschooling networks that use the resources. And the thing is latticed with a back end that's basically a digital kind of portfolio and content and time and skill sharing network. So it's a mouthful, but it's decently thought out. And there's groups that are working on comparable models, basically saying like, we can't keep running these big, giant, centralized schools. And the pandemic proved that to us. We have digital technologies where we could do this in a distributed fashion. We have parents who want to be involved in their kids' education and don't want to leave it to the experts, so-called, and who also are being unemployed by structural technological factors. So alongside the Education Hub Network, I recommend a bunch of other sociological miracles, I call them, social miracles, which would have to be in place to change the education system as much as I suggest it needs to be changed. So I would recommend, checking out the book for the kind of full explanation there. But it's an idea that has come back to me from people who've never read my book and already been working on it and then read my book and encountered me. So there's something there that's not really my idea, that is, in a sense, some deep potentiality in digital education that wants to emerge, which is fundamentally different than Khan Academy and Wikipedia and that stuff, which is much more about the networked potentials rather than just some fancy new form of broadcast. So
Yeah, it sounds amazing, like an amazing vision. Yeah.
it's not just mine, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The potentiality. Thank you.
Does Alexander have his hand up there?
We have Madalena actually,
Madeleine, okay.
and then we'll go to Alexander if we've got time.
Ah, Madeleine. Yeah.
We need you to unmute.
Thank you. It's really a very simple question. I'm just curious because I know you did a piece on, or Consilience did a piece on Audrey Tang and Taiwan, and they came up with this fighting rumor with humor, employing actual comedians to create memes that went viral, like within 2 hours of mostly Chinese misinformation. I'm just wondering what you think of that, because everything's getting so ominous and serious that felt really powerful.
Yeah, it is quite powerful. And as I said, there are humor. I didn't say anything about humor yet. What I was going to say is that there are places where something like propaganda has a role in contemporary circumstances. Sometimes countering propaganda with something that's a little bit like propaganda makes sense. And as far as like manipulative information goes, comedy is a really interesting case, right? Because like think about the fact that a comedian will make you laugh even if you don't want to laugh. So is he manipulating your whole nervous system somehow with his language? And the answer is yes. Like it's very interesting how humor works. And that's why humor is sublimated aggression, right? Because the other way you can use your language to completely affect someone's nervous system, despite their best attempts for you not to do so, is through kind of violent use of language. So the use of humor is classic propaganda technique, actually. It's back when Comenius was fighting propaganda in the 1600s. There were hilarious posters made about the Pope, for example, and vice versa, of course. So the use of humor to degrade the object of propaganda, and the use of humor to lighten the spirits of those on your own side is again like a very classic propaganda trope. So the question would be, are they using this humor to really counter misinformation? Or are they using this humor to counter something which may or may not be misinformation, which they're deciding they want to class as misinformation? Now, if they're combating actual demonstrable Chinese intelligence information with humor, then that's awesome. If they're suppressing their own citizens' perspectives on crucial issues by funding centralized late night TV talk show comedy public health campaigns, then that's different. All right. So it's all about context. Yeah.
No, I hear you. Of course, it's always about the context. However, would it be fair to say that when somebody is practicing humor, they're not invoking teacherly authority?
Oh, no. I mean, I really don't know. I mean, it's very interesting, like from like linguistic philosophy, psychoanalytical, like what is humor? How does that work? I do know that I, as a teacher, invoke humor all the time. But when I invoke humor, it's spontaneous, but it's also often strategic. Right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where, again, there's not a hard and fast line between propaganda and education. They bleed into one another. And so sometimes teachers will, mix the two to like get you hooked on what I'm saying and trick you. And now you're tricked and now you're into an actual learning experience, right? So humor has this disorienting and I think a really great effect in educational context. But of course, you can also use humor to completely undermine someone's authority who's just said something very serious.
Sure.
So So you have to be very careful. I had a friend who was a Buddhist scholar who was translating Sanskrit and looking at the Buddhist sutras and basically saying, like, what is the use of humor in the Buddhist sutras? And it turns out that the Buddha was constantly saying things that were funny. And many of the interpreters, especially in the West, didn't realize that it was humor and thought that he was saying, like, your head would explode into 1,000 pieces in like a serious way. And there must be some esoteric reference for that. So humor has been a pedagogical device, you know, since time immemorial. My guess would be that Socrates was actually probably pretty hilarious. So
Thank you.
yeah, that's an interesting question.
Nice. Alexander?
Calling me by my formal name.
That's what your Zoom
hey,
name
Zach.
is, darling.
I find the definition of the unbridgeable asymmetry really compelling, and I have a question for you. It's something I think about. I don't know if you already touched on it in other talks and whatnot, but what about legacy propaganda and what I might call accidental or incidental propaganda, where there may have been a first propagandizer, but the propagandized have long outlived them, and you have these teacherly authorities that do intend to make that gap, that asymmetry, bridgeable, but the underlying ideology is so pervasive that it simply just goes unquestioned. So, you know, I don't know, what comes to mind is maybe money or progress, or, you know, these sort of macro propagandas, and because those are things that I think probably even more about than sort of the particular propaganda. So I was curious what, you know, how do you grok that?
Totally. And this is where things get a little bit weird and disorienting and scary, because what you have is the combination of propaganda studies with Baudrillardian simulation theory, where a kind of calcification and layering on of epochs of propaganda, right? And this is also a theory of civilizational collapse, basically, that the longer we run these manipulative information campaigns to keep the civilization together, the deeper the civilization gets into simulations of reality propagated to the people living within it. So that becomes this interesting and again disorienting sense of how deep and how long have these propaganda campaigns gone. So I believe that the propaganda campaigns involving hell as a mimetic complex have been going on in the Western world since the 30 Years' War, that it became thematized as a weapon and has continually been used as a weapon, so that we can't think straight about anything like a conception of punishment in the afterlife for acts in current life, let's say, because we've been propagandized for hundreds of years with ideas about hell. And money is another interesting one. And there's other ones that get pretty deep. And then you can see in the current kind of conspiracy theory space that on shorter time durations, like let's just say since the 60s, you get these like temporally unfolding kind of like almost like geological strata in the noosphere of like boom, 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 deepening into these simulations. And it's important to get simulations aren't unreal. That's what's so weird about it, is that they're really convincing. And they usually involve your prior experiences with actual reality and often little bits of reality. So you have to think about the Baudrillardian simulation hypothesis, not as VR, but as like AR. That you're layering over top of your actual encountered experience, these kind of like historical memories of illusion. So you're completely right to see it that way. And that means that the educational work that occurs in this kind of time between worlds I'm arguing for is fundamental at that level. And that's why Comenius was such a total OG kind of badass, because he was messing around with fundamentally, what does it mean to be human? We have to think at that level.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have an economy? What does it mean to have an economy? What does it mean to be a religion? What's the nature of our knowledge about the natural world?
So you do have like a second layer of sort of where it's not just the bridging the gap of the asymmetry of teacherly authority, but also that the fundaments need to be examined. And you know.
And so if you're in a good teacher-student relationship, you bridge that epistemic asymmetry, and then you start to both inquire together about what the hell is actually going on. And that's key, like that we need to renew teacherly authority precisely so we can actually renew collective inquiry into the nature of the reality that we're living in. That's so yeah, if you were to, but again, it's kind of one of those things where you can put some of the background of the simulation in question, but you can't put it all in question at the same time. Some of it actually constitutes non-negotiable aspects of the life world, period, which aren't propaganda. So you don't want to throw those away. And then some of them represent really deep-seated mimetic patterns, which end up being presuppositions for your putting other parts of the simulation in question. You see? So it becomes a very complex point at this point, deep in the simulation, about how we actually maneuver through this and return to reality, which is usually why I talk about a return to kind of like a form of practical metaphysics, which is a little bit like exploring the embodied experience of teacherly dynamics with a few other people in an actual lived context, in a non-mediated, non-simulated context. And remember that is a thing. But awesome question. Yeah.
Cool.
So we're getting up to the hour now, right? We have a couple more minutes. Owen, should we close here, or should we do one more question?
Well, I had a little question, and maybe we can fire it. I was just wondering, Zach, since Cadell and I, one of the things we were trying to tease out last week is perhaps what are some of the principles for entering in these teacher-student relationships? And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on how we can skillfully be teachers or skillfully be students.
So, yeah, it's interesting, right? So we're at a like reflective point in the culture because we've been deworlded. So this question would never arisen in another cultural context, because it'd be completely clear. Like, oh, I want to be someone who dyes leather. Oh, that dude dyes leather. Like, it's not, you don't have to establish, there's a guild that already exists, and there's no one questioning the cultural assumptions that the guild should exist or not. Or if they are, they're like crazy wackos from another culture or something, right? So, but we're in a context where we are precisely confronted with the need to think again about how do we come together in educational relationships and negotiate all that. And in completely unstructured, non-bureaucratized contexts, you end up getting what are called multiple role relationships. And this is what most of the spiritual teachers don't see. Now, the ones working in formalized contexts are different because they've got some lineage of formal structure, like a monastic structure. But for just a freewheeling thing, you end up with multiple role relationships, which means like, yes, you're my teacher, but you're also this dude that we're pooling money with to own this property, but you're also not smarter than me about these aspects of this part of your life. And we're also friends, right, in some way. And so that's a strange, dare I say, meta-modern type of social precarity, which makes the teacher-student relationship and actually the dynamics of the multiple role relationship need to be talked about. That you don't want to stumble into a teacher-student relationship and end up in all of these complex sets of obligations and expectations without really kind of knowing it. So the first piece of advice would be to not formalize it, contract it. That's bullshit. But spend, let's say, 20% of your time talking about the nature of the relationship itself. And good parents do this, good teachers do this. Good educators do this spontaneously. Oh, here's what we're doing now, by the way. Like, you're doing this, I'm doing this, here's why we're doing it. Remember that thing we talked about then? That still holds, right? We're doing it this way. Oh, but now the situation's changed. Do you know how to do this? Do you still need me to be in this role with you or not? So that ongoing reflection on the nature of the relationship, something about 20 to 30% of total communication being about the relationship itself, is some of the advice that I give, because it's a complex, it's like a marriage or something. It's a complex enough relationship that you better spend time talking about the relationship, and you better be good at talking about the relationship. It'll go smooth for a long time, of course, but precisely when thresholds are crossed, like when the student comes up to the teacher's level at some point, usually it's like all the shit fucking hits the fan, but that can be avoided. It can be avoided. So that's like a general bit of advice there, is I think, know that it be precisely because it's such Wild West kind of context that there should be time talking about that relationship. If the teacher is like, no, I'm not going to talk about a relationship with you, it's not a good sign. Not a good sign. And that's worth noting. Like, there was a lot of bullshit that teachers got away with in institutionalized contexts, which they cannot get away with in non-institutionalized contexts unless they're allowed to, basically. Whereas before, they were basically given sanction to by large social forces. Now, in these contexts, you don't need to engage with these people if you don't want to. And there is an obligation for them to have a reflective stance towards the relationships that they're forming with people, especially when there's major epistemic. Like, I'm not talking about like stupid 20-year-old life coaches. Like, I'm talking about like people with really actually demonstrable epistemic asymmetry. When you know you have less epistemic asymmetry than when you engage with them, that is a situation where you are the more vulnerable party. So do you know that they relate to you in that educational manner that I described, where there is a non-expectation of reciprocation of investment of energy? This is very important. This is about, are they instrumentalizing you or not? Is there a non-expectation of reciprocal return on investment, which is to say, like, they're going to teach you and they don't expect to get anything for it? That the accomplishment of intergenerational transmission is the goal. So this is where Socrates says, why are you charging money? Right? Socrates to the sophists, right? So it's complex. It's legitimately complex these days, about how that type of generosity, asymmetric generosity. Now, there's a generosity of student to teacher, right? There's the allowing of me allowing you to be my teacher is an act of generosity. It's a huge act that many people cannot actually perform, right? But because it's an asymmetric relationship, remember, psychoanalytically, like, dependency, vulnerability built in here to our being, then you need to know that the teacher holds that regard. Otherwise, it's a different kind of relationship. It doesn't mean you can't learn from them, but it does mean there's a level of trust and mutual commitment that will not be engaged, basically, something like that. So that's my answer there.